Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ameren Missouri BDRP program changes, exciting new changes to the upcoming season. I'm Tyann Harrer, and I will be the moderator today. Next slide, please. First, I want to introduce today's speakers from Enel. Jeff Hood is a customer success manager at Enel North America. He focuses on working with commercial, industrial, and institutional customers to ensure success in demand response. And then we also have Quincy Gottwig, senior portfolio manager from Enel North America. He partners with customers to provide program education, maximize revenue, and renew agreements in US and Canada markets. Next slide, please. I just want to go over the agenda today before I turn it over to the speakers. The first thing is we're going to go over the program overview. Then we're going to go over what's changing. Next, we'll talk about the program details, and then there will be a Q&A at the end. Please make sure to submit all your questions in the questions portion of your menu in GoToWebinar. And now I will turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you, Tyann. Again, my name is Jeff Hood. I'm the Customer Success Manager for the Ameren region. I've been with Enel for the past 10 years, and my goal is to ensure that our portfolio of customers have everything they need to be successful in demand response. You know, globally, Enel has been ensuring grid stability through its participation in demand response for many, many years. We are also very proud of our strong regulatory affairs presence that ensures the best results for you, our customers. First and foremost, we want to thank you for helping your neighbors and community by supporting the Ameren grid. For those of you that did participate in 2024, your contributions led to 144 megawatts of curtailment. Since 2019, we have built a very strong portfolio of more than 1,150 customers throughout the Ameren region that are participating to help the grid in times of need. Together, through your collective action, we are able to create a more resilient grid. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what happens when an actual dispatch is triggered. You will receive up to 6 hours notice that an event is going to be called. This could be a little less depending on the timing of the event, but Ameren's goal is to ensure participants have as much notice as possible to prepare for the event. Once you receive the notification, please confirm your participation by responding to either text, email, or phone call. If your site is unconfirmed, myself or members of our support team will attempt to contact you prior to the event to ensure that you will be participating. One thing to note is we do encourage customers not to curtail too soon, but rather begin your processes to ensure that you are at your curtailment target at the start time of the event. You can access your target and performance by logging into your account and view the active dispatches screen. As you can see here on the slide, this looks like what a perfect dispatch looks like. The site started curtailing right before that green box, which is when the actual event started. And then during the event, continue to monitor your usage and remain within that targeted curtailment zone. Once the event is ended, simply return to normal operations. Next slide. So whether you're a new customer working with your onboarding team on your energy reduction plan, or an existing customer reviewing your energy reduction plan, we work with you to come up with a plan that works best for your operations. Now, our customers reduce their energy consumption using a variety of options. Some of these include reducing HVA load and lighting, changing settings in cold storage or freezer operations. Some customers participate using properly permitted backup generators, or dialing back pumps, or turning off certain pieces of equipment within your operations. So that's a basic overview of Demand Response 101. I'll turn it over now to Quincy to review what changes to the program are going to be taking place soon.
Awesome, thank you, Jeff. Once again, I'm Quincy. I'm an account manager with Enel, and we're going to be working closely with a lot of you over the coming months and year to make sure that you're understanding these new program changes and that our updated agreements reflect these new program rules. So with that, let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into what's changing with the program. So these changes are going to roll out on June 1st of this year. And in summary, there's going to be an increase to the payment rate for the program. The program period is also going to be expanding and is going to be a year-round program going forward. And we're going to cover that in a little bit more detail in the next slide. There's also going to be some changes in terms of how you're enrolled in the program and how your performance is going to be measured against your enrollment. And lastly, there's going to be some slight differences in terms of the timing of demand response tests. So with that, let's take a deeper dive into some of these upcoming changes. So starting on the top left-hand side of the slide, hours of availability. As I mentioned, this is going to be moving to a year-round program, and the program is going to start each year on June 1st and go through May 31st of the following year. Because this is moving to a year-round program, the program year is going to be separated into 4 different seasons. And you can see that breakdown on the bottom of the slide here. There'll be a summer, fall, winter, and spring season. So under the new program rules, it'll be a requirement that you at least participate in the summer season, June through August. And from there, you'll have full flexibility to determine what combination of fall, winter, and spring seasons that you want to participate in addition to the summer. Each facility will also have their individual enrollment for each of these seasons. While you could have the same enrollment across all 4 seasons, we do realize that there might be changes to your operations at your facility or changes to your load shape based on what time of year we fall in. So for that reason, you'll have the ability to customize your enrollment levels ahead of each season. We'll send you an email with a proposed enrollment several weeks out from the start of each season, and that proposed enrollment will be based off of your historical performance in the program and also data that we have from your electric meter. Once you receive that email, you'll have an opportunity to provide us feedback on the enrollment level based on your knowledge of your operations in the upcoming season and your appetite to participate. So moving over to the second piece on the testing requirements, there's still going to only be 2 annual tests per year, and they're going to be 1 hour in duration. So that's remaining the same, but the timing of these tests is going to look a little bit different. So the first test each year will take place in the summer season and most likely in the month of August. If there was an emergency event called earlier in the summer, for example, in June or July, we will base your performance for that season off of your performance in the emergency event, and a test will not be held. The second test each year will occur in the winter season and most likely in the month of February. And very similar to summer, if there was an emergency event called earlier in the winter, for example, in December or January, we will use your performance in the emergency event as your basis for your payment for that season. In terms of dispatch timing, emergency events are most likely to occur in the late afternoon in the summer and early mornings in the winter. And this often coincides when we see peak demand on the grid and when the grid is most constrained. For this reason, we're also attempt as best we can to schedule tests that coincide with these timeframes, as we want tests to replicate an emergency event as much as possible so that you feel prepared and confident going into a true emergency event. And lastly, as Jeff mentioned earlier, you'll receive a maximum of 6 hours advance notice ahead of the start of a dispatch. So let's take a little bit closer look on how enrollments and performance measurement is going to change under the new program rules. So drawing your attention to the graph on the right-hand side of the slide, and specifically the two blue bars at the top of the graph labeled summer CP and winter CP, CP standing for coincidental peak. So MISO, the grid operator that covers the Midwestern states, including Ameren service territory, looks at each season throughout the year and identifies what day of that season and what specific hour of that day we saw demand across the entire grid at its highest. Once they identify that day and time, they will look at your individual facility and see what kind of demand they were contributing to this peak demand across the whole grid. So they'll be looking at the hour preceding the peak demand hour, the hour during the peak demand, and the hour after peak demand, and averaging your load across those 3 hours to come up with your seasonal coincidental peak. This number is important because it'll essentially be your baseline for each season in the program. And by baseline, that means that when there is a demand response dispatch called, you'll want to be below the baseline to start experiencing positive performance and earning through the dispatch. Once again, this data is based off of, or this information is based off of data from your electric meter. So this is a static number that is not flexible and cannot be changed once the season starts. So drawing your attention to the graph again on the right side, looking at now the bottom of the graph where you see those two orange bars, summer FSL and winter FSL. FSL standing for firm service level. This is essentially the target that you want to drop your facility's demand down to in a demand response dispatch. So if you are at or below your FSL during a dispatch, you're experiencing 100% performance, and you'll receive your maximum payment for that season if you're able to maintain your load at that FSL through the entirety of the dispatch. This FSL number is flexible, and this is kind of the main piece of information that we'll be asking for your feedback on when sending out your proposed enrollments ahead of each season. You'll have the flexibility to set your FSL higher or lower based on your knowledge of your facility's operations, your seasonal load shape, and your appetite to participate. So lastly, on that graph on the right-hand side there, you can kind of see that the difference between the coincidental peak and the FSL, that is ultimately the amount that you're enrolled for and committed for on each season, and will be the basis for how we determine your payment amount for that season. So moving on to some details on payments. So the current payment rate in the program is $25,000 per megawatt year, and that's going to be almost doubling to $48,000 per megawatt year. And this is in large part to recognize that this is moving to a year-round program, and we want the compensation to reflect that. Just to add some additional nuance here, this $48,000 per megawatt year rate presumes that you're enrolled in all 4 seasons of the program. If you determine that you do not want to enroll year-round in the program, you will have a rate that's lower than the $48,000 per megawatt year, and you can work with Jeff, myself, or our support team to identify what your compensation rate would be and what your potential earnings would be based off of what seasons you're participating in. The table in the center of the slide here shows some example enrollments and what the expected earnings would be at that enrollment level. And this is presuming that you're enrolled year-round and receiving the maximum $48,000 per megawatt year rate. Just like the current program, there's no cost to participate in the program. There's no exposure to any out-of-pocket penalties if there are extenuating circumstances and you're not able to participate in the dispatch. And as I mentioned, we will be working with you closely to help you maximize your earnings and identifying what seasons you can participate in and what the resulting compensation would be. So a little bit more detail on payments here. In terms of measuring your performance, we'll look at all test or emergency event hours in a given season and look at your average load across all those event hours to come up with sort of an average level of demand that you're able to reach across all events. Once we come up with that average demand, we'll multiply that by the seasonal compensation rate to determine how much you earned for that season. You'll receive one payment per season, and those will be distributed roughly 2 months after the end of each season. So that really covers most of the changes that are coming into effect June 1st of 2025. I know that was a lot of information, so hopefully you've been putting your questions in the Q&A portion of the webinar platform. If we're not able to get any of those today, you can feel free to follow up with Jeff, myself, or our support team, and we will work with you to make sure that we get your questions answered. So with that, I'll hand it over to Tyann to moderate the Q&A portion. So take it away, Tyann. Do we have any questions that have come in yet?
Yes, we did have a few questions that have come in, but feel free to send more questions if the audience has any. But thank you so much, Quincy and Jeff, for that presentation. The first question we received was, under the new year-round program, how do I manage my enrollment season to season?
I can take that. So just to reiterate once again, I'm going to bump back the slides here so we have a little visual representation. Looking at the sort of seasonal breakdown at the bottom here, as I mentioned, we'll be contacting you in the weeks leading up to each season, and we'll send you an email with a proposed enrollment level. You'll then log in to our platform where you can view that proposed enrollment level, and then you can submit feedback to us based off of, once again, your operations, your knowledge of your load shape, and your appetite to participate in the coming year. You can also, at that time, when we send you a proposed enrollment, you can also make the option to opt out of the upcoming season if you do not want to participate. So there'll be that opportunity for interacting with us in the weeks and months leading up to each season to identify what your enrollment level will be. And obviously over time, as you have more experience participating in these new seasons, that might change over time, and we'll be able to make adjustments.
Awesome.
Yeah, just to reiterate there too, if we don't receive any feedback, either myself, Quincy, support, or through your nomination link, it's kind of like a passive enrollment, right? For open enrollment for insurance. So if you don't respond, whatever came across in that email is what you're going to be nominated for that season.
Great point, Jeff.
Thank you, Quincy and Jeff. So we did get a few more questions. If enrolled in summer, fall, and spring, will there still be 2 tests?
If you are not enrolled in the winter season, you'll have 1 annual test in the summer.
Okay, that answers that one. This another question is, how is spring and fall performance measured?
That's a great question. So if you have a test in the summer season, and then we're going into the fall season, we will look at how you performed in the test in the summer and use that as a basis for your performance in the fall season. Similar to winter and spring as well, there was a test in the winter, and then we go into the spring and there's no event called, we'll use your performance during the winter months as a basis for your spring payment.
Thank you. Another question is, how important is it to get FSL accurate? Will you get better savings if you are close to established FSL, or better if FSL is higher and you just deliver more demand savings?
That is a great question as well. Jeff, do you want to take that one?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time, Tyann?
Yep. How important is it to get FSL accurate? Will you get better savings if you are close to established FSL, or better if FSL is higher and you just deliver more demand savings?
I mean, it kind of, as Quincy noted, it's important to as you get to that kind of that target zone during your dispatch, to stay down during that whole current time, and stay at that level, throughout the whole event. I don't know, Quincy, if you want to reiterate more on that.
Yeah, and I think I'm understanding the nature of the question here. Is that kind of is it more advantageous to set a more conservative FSL and try to achieve a lot lower than that during a dispatch, or is it better to be more aggressive and set a lower FSL? I would say that the best case scenario is trying to dial in your FSL to be as accurate as possible in terms of what you think you can actually achieve during a dispatch. The reason being is that ultimately when you're setting that FSL, that is determining how much you're committed for in the program. And then we are sending that to Ameren and MISO, the grid operator, to convey to them how much collectively all the participants in the program can feasibly provide. So if you're being as accurate with that as possible, that allows us to give a lot more accurate representation to Ameren and MISO so that they understand how much demand response they have as a resource when a true emergency event happens. So accuracy in those scenarios is really crucial for them to ensure that the grid remains stable, and that there are no things like blackouts or brownouts on the grid. So I would say try to dial in that FSL as accurate as possible based on what you think you can feasibly hit. That being said, it's difficult to get that number exactly every time, and things do change year to year. So we'll work with you over time to continue dialing in that number, and we'll work with you ahead of each enrollment season to make sure that we're discussing that FSL and what's attainable for you.
Yeah, just to reiterate too, I mean, we try to be, our goal is to be not only good stewards to Ameren, to provide them with as much accurate data as we can as far as what that portfolio looks like, but also be good stewards to our customers to make sure that we're, hitting that targeted FSL so you all can maximize your earnings during the season.
Awesome, thank you both. Another question is, it was stated the payment calculation averaged all the events as well as testing events. If no event is called, is there a payment for the testing events?
Can you repeat that one more time, Tyann?
Yes. It was stated the payment calculation averaged all the events as well as testing events. If no event is called, is there a payment for the testing events?
So just to recap here on the test events. So there'll be one test in the summer, one test in the winter. If there was no emergency event called yet in either of those seasons, we'll have a test likely in the last month of those seasons, so August and February. The performance in that test event would ultimately determine your payment for the year. Those tests are only 1 hour in duration, so we would just look at simply your performance, how well you performed against your enrollment during that 1 hour test to determine your payment for the season. And like we were talking about a couple of questions earlier, if we're in the fall or spring season, there hasn't been a test, we'll look at that prior season where there was a test and use that as the basis for your payment on that season. If there's an emergency event called in the summer or winter, we will use your performance in that emergency event as the basis for your payment, and there will not be a test. Emergency events could be longer than an hour, so that's why we say we average across all hours of events. So let's say an emergency event is 3 hours in duration. We'll look at how you performed across those 3 hours to come up with your sort of average performance number, determined how well you performed across the event. And then we'll multiply that by the payment rate to determine how you performed in that season. And then that would carry over to the fall or spring season if there was no other tests or emergency events. Hopefully that covers that question. Do you have anything you want to add there, Jeff?
Yes, I mean, that's pretty similar to what we saw last year, and really kind of what we see now, or with the existing program, right? Was last year we didn't have any emergency events called during the summer. We held 2 audits in August, I believe it was, and that sets your payment for that year for those capacity payments. So yeah, that's perfect.
Great, thank you. Another question is, Will failure to participate in one season impact the ability for full payout in another season?
Can you read that one more time?
Yeah, will failure to participate in one season impact the ability for full payout in another season?
Good question. And just to reiterate again, if a test was called in the summer and you were unable to participate in that test, that's going to impact your payment for the summer season. If we then go into the fall and no emergency event is called, then your lack of performance in the summer event will also impact your payment for the fall season. Just to add some nuance there, let's say there was a test in the summer and you weren't able to perform and we get into the fall, but then an emergency event is called in the fall, your fall payment would be based off of your performance in the emergency event. So yes, there is some carryover between seasons, between the summer and fall seasons, and then the winter and spring season.
Awesome, thank you. Another question is, how is the MISO expected peak hour calculated and our corresponding CP from prior years?
So how is the seasonal quintil peak calculated?
Yes,
so,
the expected peak hour calculated in our corresponding CP from prior years. I don't know if they mean from prior, how is it from prior
this
years?
is a great question. So for the upcoming summer season that starts on June 1st, to figure out what your coincidental peak is for this upcoming summer season, MISO and Ameren will be looking at your data from the previous summer season, so in 2024, June through August. And then they will identify the coincident peak across the whole grid during that time frame from 2024, and then look at your individual facilities' contribution to that peak demand across the grid in the hour before the peak hour, the hour during the peak hour, and the hour after the peak hour. And then we'll average your demand across those 3 hours to identify your coincident peak for the upcoming year. So essentially, they're always looking a year in the past and what your load was during that previous season when there was peak demand to do the calculation for your coincidental peak each season.
Okay, great. The next one is, what is early AM? Midnight to 4 a.m., 4 a.m. to 6 a.m., 6 to 11 a.m.? Like what, I think this person is asking, what is early AM defined as?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of dispatch timing, Jeff, maybe you have a little bit more insight into typical timing for events in the summer.
Yeah, I mean, if we look historically at summer events, they are generally in the afternoon when it's, particularly hot and humid in the region. So we may see a potential event called, say, between 3 and 6, 3 and 7. What we've seen in a lot of other markets that I manage as well is these winter events do tend to get called earlier in the mornings. So I've got some other areas that I've been involved with that have, been dispatched at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning just because of the extreme cold. But that's just a generality of when you could expect a potential event to be called during those seasons.
Yeah, and I think we have historical data kind of showing when in the summer an emergency event is typically been called, but because this will be our first year going to a year-round program and having a program during the winter seasons, we don't have a lot of information on when emergency events have been called during the winter season because that hasn't existed in the past. So I think going forward, we'll start to get a little bit more clarity on when winter events will typically be called. in the early mornings, but I believe we could also follow up with Ameren or MISO to get a little bit more information on what times of morning they're typically seeing those peaks, so we can give you a little bit more precision on when you might expect an early morning event. So we can set that as a potential follow-up to whoever asked that question. But that's a good one.
Awesome. The next one is, can we assume we could have a winter or summer event in the spring or fall?
I'm not sure I quite understand that question.
We can reach out, yeah, for follow-up after too.
Yeah, we can reach out for some extra clarity there.
I mean, my assumption would be similar to other programs that say you have a really, really cold snap in what we call a shoulder month, like not kind of the summer or the winter. We have seen events called in these other shoulder months where we have an extreme heat wave come through, outside of those, the normal summer or normal winter, what we've proposed on here. So, I guess there is that possibility. I guess we can clarify on that too, but you never know with the weather patterns we're seeing with extreme heat and extreme cold here over the last few years. Could an event be called in what would be deemed a spring season, but we have a really strong heat wave or cold wave, come through. So.
Thanks, Jeff.
The next one was, can we sign up for the entire year, or can this only be decided for each season?
I'm not sure if I know the answer to that question. We'll have to follow up on that. What I will say is that there will be an enrollment period ahead of each season. That'll give you that opportunity to customize your enrollment level for that season based off any changes in your operations or your load shape. But you can certainly let us know maybe ahead of the summer season before the program year begins if you want to maintain that same enrollment level throughout the entire year. You can certainly communicate that to us, and then we can keep that information on file so that when we start getting to the next season, that we just simply keep proposing the same enrollment to you for each season. And as Jeff was mentioning, if you don't respond or provide feedback to the proposed enrollment, we'll proceed with that proposed enrollment as it is. So definitely, if you want to do that strategy, communicate us to that in advance, and then we'll incorporate that into our messaging and communications ahead of each season.
Okay, the next one is, are you not paid for overachieving? So I think they want to know if if you overachieve, are you paid for it?
I don't know the answer to that question. Do you, Jeff? That might be one we need to follow up on.
Yeah, I don't. Traditionally, it's been what we call a capacity payment, right? So what you sign up for of what you're going to deliver, it kind of is what it is. That's been my understanding, in the previous years, that you're basically paid for what that nominated value is for that summer, as we've done before. But yeah, certainly worth following up on to see if there's a overperformance during an audit or an event, what does that lead to, or what could that mean for the customer?
Yeah. And at the very least, if we see that you're overperforming and dropping a lot lower than your FSL for a given event, certainly the next year when that season rolls around, we'll be discussing that with you to say, hey, maybe we want to set a lower FSL target for this year since you overachieved last year. So we'll work with you ahead of those seasons to make sure that we're fine tuning that and taking into account how you performed that last season, especially if you overperformed.
Awesome. The next question is, why were these changes made?
Jeff, do you want to touch on that?
I'll have to defer to you on that, Quincy. I think you've been a lot more involved with the Ameren team as far as why they implemented these changes.
No, absolutely. Well, simply put, the program typically was in the summer season. In the past, the program ran from May to the end of September of each year. And this is when Ameren and MISO specifically were most worried about emergency events on the grid and grid constraints. So that's why that program existed during those months previously. Now with changes to the grid, changes to the amount of demand that they're seeing in different times of the year, that's creating the need to have a year-round program to make sure that the grid and your facilities are protected year-round if an emergency event were to occur. We could get really into the weeds on this one. It's a very complicated topic, but essentially a lot of these grid operators across the country are expected to carry a certain amount of load margin, essentially that they have a buffer zone of terms of how much supply that they have available on the grid and how much demand they expect and forecast on the grid. Once we start to get into scenarios where we're frequently seeing demand break into that buffer zone, that can indicate to grid operators like MISO that a demand response program might be appropriate so that they have a mechanism to enact when you start eating into that margin and you get close to emergency scenario. So that's kind of like the overall reason why demand response programs exist, and just with changing load patterns and demand throughout the course of the year in this service territory, they're seeing that in the future that a year-round program might be more appropriate to make sure that the grid stays stable.
Yeah, that's perfect. That makes a lot of sense, because we've also seen that same scenario play out in other programs that we manage. I've seen it in one particular program where in mine it used to be a summer-only program, and yeah, they just realized that with demand and then these extreme weather patterns that we continue to see, they just want to build more resiliency throughout the whole year. So yeah, that makes sense.
And if any of you that have facilities in other parts of the country that are participating in other demand response programs with different grid operators, you'll see that oftentimes those are year-round programs.
Awesome. What is the average number of events in each season?
I guess right now it's too early to tell, right? I mean, because if you look back at purely summer, we had no emergency events last summer, so we had just the 2 audits that were held. I think the year prior, we maybe had 1 emergency event that was called, or maybe 2 the year prior in 2023. I have to go back and look at that, but right now with these new program changes, we kind of don't know, right? With what the winter months could bring, we kind of have a good history of how this program is called traditionally in the summer months, but with it being new, it's kind of to be determined, if you will, on what winter's going to look like.
That being said, though, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, we do expect emergency events to still be a fairly rare occurrence. As Jeff mentioned, it's not uncommon in the past for a summer season to not see any emergency events at all.
Correct. So yeah, let's knock on wood that it's still the same scenario for winter months.
Right. So the next one is, when will we get our company specific SCP and FSL numbers?
So in terms of timing ahead of each enrollment season, typically we'll be targeting several weeks to a month in advance of letting you know your summer CP and FSL and letting you react to that. That being said, you can always log into our platform on apps.nlx.com And if your enrollment has already been ready and we have that information from Ameren and MISO, it could be populated in that platform as well. So you can also feel free to check in there, and you want to go to your specific site page. And then at the bottom of that page, there's an enrollments tab, and it will have this sort of information laid out there if we have received it from Ameren and MISO at that time. Ultimately, we receive this data from your electric meter, and we request it from Ameren and MISO. So really, as soon as we have that information, are able to populate in our system, we will share that with you.
Great. The next one is, we will be adding significant equipment in June, so our demand will be rising. How will this affect the CP and potential savings if based upon the prior year?
Great question as well. So if we're looking at the previous sort of summer to establish what your CP is, but then your demand is going to go up, that might actually create a scenario. Let me think about this. So if the demand was much lower when the CP was established, and then the demand goes up. So in that scenario, that might present a more difficult scenario for participating, because really your true demand once you install the new equipment is going to be much higher, but your baseline is going to be based off of a number when your demand was much lower. So in those certain kind of scenarios, that would be where you might want to reach out to Jeff, myself, or a support team to see what an appropriate enrollment strategy might be, given how much load you expect to increase for that summer month. And we can work with you to identify a strategy that's going to make sure that you're getting your maximum payment, because this is an issue we often see with many demand response programs and participants in other markets as well. So we'd be happy to share, information and learnings from those as well that you can apply to your upcoming seasonal enrollment.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, you two, for answering a bunch of questions. We still have quite a few questions. I think some are specific to unique scenarios. So any questions that we weren't able to answer today, we will follow up with you after this webinar and make sure that we are able to answer your questions. And again, you can always reach out to Quimsy, Jeff, or support as well to help you. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.